You are listening to the Centropic Oracle, an audiobook podcast of science fiction and fantasy short stories that make you think and feel. Moment of Inertia by D.A. D'Amico. Dizziness briefly fogged my vision as the girl came into view again. I'd drawn crosshairs on the port with a blue wax marker, and as the bottom maintenance plate of the hab wheel rotated past, I called out, "Mark." "Check that," the frail voice whispered, and Mikhail began coughing again. I struggled to keep from turning, to keep my mind on the girl. She looked a little bit like my own daughter, Nasha, gone almost 19 years now. The girl waved. Her short, pale fingers, palm forward, folded twice, and then tilted to the left. She duplicated this pattern 3 times before the hab's angular velocity pulled her from my sight. "What do we have?" I asked. "About a rotation a minute," Mikhail said slowly. He gurgled like a drowning man. "She's a smart kid." I tried to keep his mind on something other than himself. "She knows her orbiter sign language, and she's got a cool head. She's asking for help, but she took the time to sign please at the end." "She'll grow old out here." The orbiter's superstitious phrase sputtered from Mikhail's lips easily. "If we live." "Don't talk that way." I turned from the port. The hab's rotation wouldn't bring the girl back for about 40 seconds or so. A little blood still floated in mild eddies from the control pit's air system, but the filters had most of it trapped by now. Mikhail lay on a deck couch where I'd found him, fully reclined and strapped in. He was in rough shape. Something had torn through him when the explosion hit, scoring a downward groove at least 2 centimeters deep along the length of his upper thigh, damaging his flight suit and ruining his ability to pressure up. The cabin had sealed itself eventually. The fiber steel wrapper separating the 2-stage Nylar epoxy within the hull had breached, and the epoxy had ballooned outward, combining in the gaps, leaving jagged gray stalagmites and stalactites like ferocious rubber teeth. But Mikhail had suffered some serious decompression damage in those few minutes. I'd slapped a self-med diagnostic leech onto his arm. The tiny green plastic device would administer a combination of sedatives and antibiotics in an attempt to keep him stable, but there wasn't much more I could do. Still, he'd fared better than the other 2. I tried not to glance at the bodies at the end of the long compartment, shrouded in foil blankets and tacked to a utility harness like discarded tools. If I hadn't been homesick, lost in melancholy while gawking at Luna in the ship's viewing gallery, Mikhail would be dead as well. I should have been asleep in my quarters on Hab 2, but instead I had loitered in the open access area adjacent to the control pit to use the telescope. "What about the other Hab?" Mikhail wheezed. I shushed him. "Conserve your strength. I'll let you know if I detect a change." The Habs were a matched set of counter-rotational habitation modules, living quarters and gravity-stabilized storage zones for delicate organics, plants, terrestrial animals, volatile chemistry. The explosion had sheared them from the upright flat plank of the thrust module's body. Hab 1 drifted about 60 meters from the port, still rotating with considerable momentum. Half the cameras in the control pit were out, so I only had a glancing view of Hab 2, but it looked stationary in relation to the thrust module. "She's coming up again." I pulled myself around to face the port once more. Communication from the Habs to the thrust module had been wired only. With the central trunk in tatters, there was no longer a direct link. It was fortunate this girl had been near the airlock portal when the accident occurred. "What is your name?" I signed as she rolled past. For a moment she blurred, and I thought my dizziness had returned. "Mary." Her short fingers moved formally through the glyphs. "Please help me." The Hab window rotated out of view. I waited for it to return. "Hi, Mary. I'm Jamal," I signed. "Are you hurt?" "Hello, Jamal. I'm afraid. I'm not hurt, but scared." And the window spun out of sight, vanishing above me, only to reappear beneath a minute later. "Help is on the way, but it will take a while," I signed. "Are there others with you?" "Yes, but they're sandwiched," she replied after the window completed another revolution. "Sandwiched?" I turned to Mikhail. "The Hebs have the ability to seal in slices during emergencies involving decompression," he gasped. "She's most likely cut off in her own slice of the Heb." "Poor girl." I thought of my daughter once more. The hab window reappeared. I continued to sign to Mary, calming her. I reassured her everything would turn out fine, although I was in no position to believe that for myself. She told me about her father and brother, both trapped on an inner slice of the hab. We spoke for what seemed like hours, signing at minute intervals. It was like talking under a strobe light. Finally, I told her to rest. The window would have been positioned on the floor while the hab was under spin, and it must have been tiring for her to lie there even in the weak quarter gravity her rotational velocity provided. I needed a rest as well. I glanced at my hands, dark claws wrinkled and bent by age. I hadn't been in space for over 40 years. I was too old, too tired, and too scared for this. I'd come out here as a final act, an impulse before I died, but this wasn't the way I'd wanted to go. I thought I was beyond caring anymore, but I was wrong. I struggled with the unfairness of it until Mikhail spoke. "The kid will be fine," he said softly. "The habs generate their own air." "I hadn't thought of that," I said, embarrassed. "As long as it stays pressurized, it'll be okay until help arrives." I floated over to the deck couch. Mikhail lay like a discarded bundle of clothes, his pale, swollen limbs hanging a few centimeters above the armrests, and his creased features straining against the pain. The self-med should have been taking care of that. I wondered if there was some way I could turn up the dosage. "I need you to check again," he whispered. I nodded. It was the third time he'd asked me to confirm the emergency signal. Pain could do that, make every minute seem like an hour. I pulled myself closer to the event pad. The large oval screen was covered in glowing icons, some in friendly colors, but most of them gray. Almost all of the control and interface apps were down, as well as many of the links to external networks and services. Every single icon labeled HAB was disabled. That was expected, but a lot of the apps related to the thrust module were out as well. It troubled me. I ran my finger over the red emergency icon, and a window popped open with a countdown and an angry-looking glyph waiting for an open channel. I pressed it. Nothing. "Still counting down." He nodded. "ETA?" "Just over 10 hours. I squinted at the small numbers. Still can't make voice or video contact, though." "It's enough to know they know," he said softly. "And they're coming," I replied. All space traffic was monitored, and every spacecraft continually pinged one of the many monitoring satellites in its flight path. Any interruption to that signal request was responded to immediately. The difference between survivors and fatalities could be measured in minutes out here. 2 new glyphs glowed to life as I watched, apps damaged by the accident that the ship's central control servers had managed to reroute. I ignored one, an inconsequential auxiliary network service. The other was the entry link for the sensor array. I tapped it, and then tapped again as options appeared. I found a false composite view of the ship from about a kilometer away. It showed the flat rail of the thrust module tilted 30 degrees, and HAB 1 rotating beside it like an old-fashioned wagon wheel. HAB 2 looked like a crashed flying saucer, battered and torn. Central portions of the HAB glowed red, and a thin scarlet line passed through the edges, as if someone had drawn an X over the image. It didn't take a flight technician to know what that meant. "HAB 2 is a mess. It really looks bad," I said. Mikhail grumbled something I didn't understand, and then he tilted his head in my direction. "What about 1? Get me a measurement that doesn't rely on guesswork." I tapped my way to a caption screen and watched the relative velocities of all 3 modules. 2 was slowly falling behind, the accident having cancelled much of its forward momentum. HAB 1 seemed to be continuing its journey at the same rate as the thrust module, or so I thought. As I watched, the numbers jumped. "You were right," I whispered. "HAB 1 is gaining on us." "Swell." My palms grew clammy. Acid burned in my belly, and I could feel myself grow cold. Mikhail tried to sit up, but agony caused him to falter. His body jerked against the restraints, bouncing in the absence of gravity. I tried to calm him, placing my hands on his arms, but his swollen flesh felt like raw bread dough, and he twitched as my fingers made contact. "Sorry," I said quickly. "Sorry." He took a deep, rattling breath before he spoke. I watched as he struggled to internalize the pain, pushing it to the back of his mind so he could function. I knew the technique. I'd learned it in the Marines decades ago. "How fast is it moving?" he asked. "Slow. It won't catch up with us for about 9 hours." He nodded, his face grim. "That gives us quite a bit of time." "To do what? That's still more than an hour before the rescue team's estimated arrival." My heart raced. The HABs were huge, and this one had a significant rotational velocity. It would shred us when it hit. It would destroy the thrust module while splitting the HAB into jagged, airless debris, killing everyone. "Should I just pretend it isn't happening?" He sighed. "If it'd make you feel better." There was a long pause. Each of us was lost in our own dark thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder how many of the people on those HABs had relatives who'd never see them again, loved ones waiting on the lunar bases of Diana and Artemis, or somewhere in the Lagrange Commonwealth. I thought of the girl, Mary, and glanced out the port. There she was, staring back with an empty innocence. She had no idea what was about to happen to her. I waved. She smiled and waved back as the window slipped out of sight. My thoughts wandered to my little Nasha, my daughter. She'd been about Mary's age when the unforgiving environment of Earth's moon had taken her. How old would she have been now? 30? 35? Time rotates our lives out of view with the same relentless rotation as the HAB module. Mary blurred and I felt the dizziness again. Then her face elongated, growing larger, and I thought I was having a stroke. What the hell was that? I looked back just as the window rotated out of view, and I noticed something just past the glass, a blob of some sort floating between the HAB and the thrust module's port. It looked like a water globule. I thought I must be seeing things because water would evaporate rapidly in space. A lake would have had to have been sitting between the two modules for there to be this much of it left this long after the accident. "What's going on?" Mikhail asked. His voice seemed stronger, as if our present crisis had fueled him somehow. "I thought I saw something strange out there." "Liquid?" he asked. "Yeah, how'd you know?" "It's Nylar epoxy A, the base resin of the hull defense. It happens in big accidents sometimes when only one layer of fiber steel gets breached. Both epoxy A and its catalyst epoxy B are evaporation-resistant polymers in liquid form. They'll combine freely in any environment, expanding into rubberized foam. Alone, they're a sticky wet nuisance." I shook my head. I wish I'd known that. I think it's what's been making me dizzy. My old eyes couldn't process the change in refraction. "How many people on HAB 1? I asked as I turned away from the event pad. My eyes watered. I felt as if I'd run a marathon in Earth gravity, but I refused to believe there was nothing we could do to stop HAB 1 from colliding with us. The projected trajectory had refined in the time since Mikhail had noticed the HAB getting closer. Now it was a virtual certainty. The wayward HAB would strike the thrust module just behind the control pit in around 7 hours. The resulting collision would almost certainly destroy both modules, killing everyone on board. When help arrived, they'd find nothing but corpses. 36 people on this hop, counting you and me," he replied. 20 in HAB 1. "That leaves 14 in HAB 2, I said. "Is there any way to find out if they're okay?" "Not without an umbilical connection." "What do we do?" I asked. He leaned forward, his smudged face puckering, and stared at the event pad. He looked better. Not good, but better. He'd probably survive, at least until HAB 1 finished us off. I sucked in a deep breath. I tried to calm myself, but my mind raced. I realized I wasn't ready to die yet, and for some reason that stunned me. I'd been slowing down over the last few years, growing less and less relevant in my own life. I felt like an old robot, clunking along as the bright, shiny new models whizzed past me. I got to the point where I was mentally holding my breath, just waiting to die. I think it had all started when my oldest son, Mozart, joined the Marines and dropped back to Earth. A couple of years later, Terrence left, running nav on a research mission to Vesta. My wife, Miane, must have felt it too. She became withdrawn, fading like an old photograph until that final day. After she passed, I had nobody, just 1,000 acres of loneliness. Tell me about yourself. I tried to move my thoughts into different territory. I needed to get out of my own head. What's your story, Mikhail?
This is it,
he sputtered and began coughing once more. I pulled myself closer, reaching for his chest. He waved my hands away.
Priyaspati overhaul, the first stop we would have made in system. It's been my home for more than 20 years, he said softly. I originally came from Earth, but the action is out here now. There's no innovation dirt side. What about you? You're not the usual space tourist.
Too old?
No, I didn't mean that, he said. You're just a little different. You don't seem to be headed toward anything. I know you're booked for Lagrange 4, but I don't see anything on your chart after that. No work visa, no relatives.
I used to be a farmineer, I said, using the old slang for farmer engineers, dating myself to a time before the first lunar habitats. I had 1,000 acres in New Biloxi, Reinhold south of Copernicus.
The new canyon they blasted out of Mare Iberium?
Yeah. I remembered a younger time, long ago, when I could still feel the freshly fabricated lunar soil under my boots, and the breezes running up the canyon from puffers hidden in the upper walls. Although by calling it new, you're dating yourself. It's been a long time since the Chinese popped those craters. I remember when I used to go out and watch the Earth, stare up past the crystal carbine shroud covering the New Biloxi portion of the trench, and watch as the sun lit up that big blue ball. It was like something magical stared down on me. I sighed, wishing for the home I had abandoned.
I have a cousin who just bought a wedge of a rift in the Aristarchus region, he said. Been there?
It's a big moon.
Yeah, sorry, he said. I'm used to artificial habitats, places where you get to know all the people.
It used to be that way, back in the day, I said wistfully.
What about now? Why you headed off-world?
I wanted to see it all once before I died, and when an opening came up, I took it, I said softly, suddenly unwilling to look him in the eyes. He nodded, his lips compressed in a tight grimace. I moved closer, but he waved me back.
I'm fine. Go on.
I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to say more. After a long pause, I just continued anyway. My children are grown, gone off to find their own way in the solar system. My wife, Miani, she passed away a couple of years back. She's waiting on me in heaven now, and I guess I came out here to get closure, to finish up loose ends. I had a dream once, and now that everyone's gone from my life, I sort of feel like I should continue down that road, see what it would have been like.
What are you going to do when you get there?
Mikhail said. He exhaled with a gurgling liquid sound. For a man trying to stay alive, you're really not trying hard enough. I changed the subject quickly. Keep quiet, conserve your strength.
For what? His voice grew cold. Here we are, chatting away, but we both know this little bit of space is going to be a jumbled hell in 5.5 hours. We should be doing something.
What? I asked, suddenly angry. Tell me what to do, and I'll do it.
I don't know,
he shouted. His fist came up, and I thought he'd slam the pad. Instead, his arm just hung there as his eyes rolled back, and he passed out.
We have no propulsion.
Mikhail pulled himself up. His face, pale angles and bruised contours, was set in a grimace of determination as he slowly and carefully tapped the oval event pad.
Not even a lateral thruster, nothing.
What about the hab? What spins it?
The habs are spun up using polyphase induction motors. Electric, supplied from the thrust module through the trunk, useless for propulsion.
I looked out. The hab's window passed by, visibly closer. Mary had fallen asleep, her small body curled into a question mark. She was so young. She'd never get a chance to live her life, never grow up. My thoughts drifted to my own children, whom I'd not seen in over a decade. I should have been headed to Earth to visit Mozart, or found a way to meet Terrence halfway, get myself out system and see the asteroid belt, even if it killed me. Instead, I chose to follow a lonely dead end. What had I been thinking? My old brain must have sputtered for a moment because something clicked when I thought of Terrence and Vesta. An idea had occurred to me. You know, I said, smiling, I remember reading this science fiction story when I was a kid. It was about a spaceship crash, and I think they used the ship's water supply as reaction mass to save themselves. The Habs have their own water tanks, don't they? Could we...
No, I remember that story too, but you're out of luck. Unless you have a cutting torch or explosives, that is. He wheezed. The water lines to the Habs are filled from the trunk. Baffles along the conduit would have sealed themselves the moment the explosion happened.
I stared out the port, depressed. The Hab window rotated past again, and I could see Mary's frizzy cloud of hair. I watched the giant wheels spin, bright in the enhanced light from the intelligent glass, and wondered where my life had gone. What was I doing here, an old man alone hundreds of thousands of kilometers from home? I should have been back on the farm tending the soy, or in the asteroid belt, or crouching under the weight of Earth's harsh gravity being introduced to the grandchildren I'd never met. But not here, not alone, not like this. My eyes clouded, welling up. I wiped them on my sleeve. When I glanced up, I noticed the distortion. I thought the tears had overwhelmed me, but then the dizziness struck, and I knew it was just a bubble of Nylar Epoxy A floating past the port. The space between the thrust module and Hab 1 must have been thick with the stuff. "Hey!" I shouted. Suddenly, I'd had another idea. "We'll be appending the mass of the thrust module to the Hab," I said excitedly. "Slowly, and with enough cushion to hopefully keep both modules from crumpling." Mikhail frowned.
What you're suggesting would take a lot of Nylar A, a really substantial amount.
"It's everywhere," I said. I tapped the port in my excitement, bouncing back against the deck couch. "There must be a lake of it between here and the Hab."
"We can't pump it from the control pit."
"We don't have to," I said. "We open one of the fill valves, and the vacuum of space does the rest. We release the Nylar Epoxy B. It mixes with the Epoxy A already out there, and..."
"But the fill valves are positioned on the outer hull."
Mikhail tried to lean forward in the couch, but fell back.
"And there's no way I can get into a spacesuit, not like this."
"I can." I spoke before I thought. He stared at me. His eyes moved along my thin frame and over my aged body. I could already tell what he was thinking. I was too old to go out there. I was too fragile. He was right, but there were no other options. "I'm it," I said with a finality that frightened me. "We have no choice, and if I don't give it a try, Hab 1's going to hit us for sure." He sighed, his swollen features churning with hidden thoughts.
"You better get ready then."
I hesitated. I thought he'd try to argue with me. Maybe I was looking for him to come up with something better, or at the very least point out the flaws in my idea. Instead, he merely nodded, and I was stuck with my own crazy plan. "Good," I said finally. "It's settled." My body grew cold. I hadn't been on the outside for decades, and I was suddenly terrified. What if I failed? What if my idea didn't work and I just managed to drag the thrust module that much closer? But my thinking was sound. I knew it. The Nylar would act like an airbag, slowing the Hab until it became part of the thrust module once more. It would make for a bumpy ride, but it was a lot better than a devastating crash. I glanced out at Mary. The Hab had gotten closer, close enough for even a young girl to notice the difference. She frowned as she came into view again, signing, "Why can I see you better?" "Your part of the ship is moving faster than ours," I signed back. "But we're going to fix that. Don't worry." "I'm not worried," she signaled. "I trust you." For some reason that made me feel worse. "I want you to tell anyone you can to hold on." When the two modules merged, it'd seriously curtail the Hab's rotational velocity. She nodded, and then I watched as she crawled across the window and out of sight.
"Keep talking,"
Mikhail said over the comlink.
"I need to know where you are at all times, understand?"
"I'm doing fine." I attached another magnetic cable stay to the outer hull, but I was lying. Each step I took echoed the hammering of my heart. My every breath felt cold, as if I'd already died. What was I doing out here? Even in my younger days, I was never the foolish hero type. I glanced up. Hab 1 spun uncomfortably close, reminding me of a gigantic rotating saw blade as it approached the flat plank of the thrust module. Mary appeared, her tiny features tight with concern, her eyes locked on mine. She knew. Somehow she understood I was doing this for her, and that's when I realized it too. I'd thought I'd lost everything worth caring about long ago. Turns out I just couldn't see the things that mattered. My priorities had become as blurred as the space I now struggled through.
What's keeping you?
I waited until Mary had rotated past one more time before answering. Even through the cloud of Nylar fluctuating like taffy between us, I could see her much more clearly now. I'm on my way. I started searching for the first fill cap. The metal of the hull looked oily and eel-like in the changing light, raising the hairs on my neck as I pulled myself over the uneven surface. The spacesuit I wore bore the name Sturdivant, the female flight coordinator. It had been the only suit small enough. The biosuit I wore underneath was my own, but the inflatable smart mesh had had a hard time compensating for the difference in body types. The boots belonged to me as well, non-magnetic and not rated for full vacuum. If I ruptured one, I'd be dead long before the modules struck each other. The wrench I held had a socket the size of my fist, and I was having a difficult time positioning it over the Nylar Epoxy B fill cap. I couldn't anchor myself properly to the hull. An occasional rain of Nylar Epoxy A pelted my suit, ricocheting from the hab fast enough to bruise. It left greasy trails across the white suit fabric and pale gray graphene torso shell.
Did you get it?
I did, just as he spoke. The wrench popped over the decameter-high flattened diamond of the cap's head, and with a slight vibration began disengaging the interlocking clips. The whole thing lifted free on its own. The cap rose, folded back, and I could see the release tab Mikhail had instructed me to look for. I got it, I said. I'm going to set it off now. Hold on. I braced myself against the hull by pulling my tether taut, and forced a splinter of plastic into the release tab. Normally, the tab would be depressed by an inner part of a pressurized pump, but we weren't working with normal out here. A geyser of beige fluid shot upward. It looked like heavily creamed coffee as it erupted from the protruding valve in a long, thin jet. It intersected small floating blobs of Nylar Epoxy A as it passed, creating teardrop-shaped bundles of rubber that careened off in every direction. A few of the smaller globules bounced back toward the hull, glancing off the flat metal and against my suit. That's when I knew it was time to get out of there. I still had several caps to pop, and the sky had begun to fill with foamy missiles as the Nylar accumulated along the spin axis. By the fourth cap, I knew I had a problem. Newton's third law was beginning to take effect, an unforeseen consequence of the constant friction interaction between the Nylar and the two modules. The thrust module had begun to turn in the opposite direction as the hab, slowly at first, but disorienting just the same.
What's happening out there?
Mikhail's voice was stronger now. The meds had finally beaten the pain, and the decompression damage was subsiding. For every action...
Got it,
he said.
Are we going to be able to get this done?
I'll give it my best shot. I could already feel fatigue setting in, but was determined to finish what I'd started. Hab 1 had moved nearer, its mottled gray surface blocking out the stars. It felt close enough to touch. The hull of the thrust module had become a lumpy moonscape of rubber hills and valleys, buffeted by meter-long spaghetti strands of congealed Nylar that whipped wildly across the surface at high velocity. It was incredibly difficult to move now without being pounded and pushed from every angle. I traveled by grasping handfuls of the spongy stuff, pulling myself slowly from mound to mound. I released 2 more caps before the Nylar got too thick for me to find any others. Then I scuttled out of the way. The soot-colored cotton candy strands of cured Nylar had become ropes, tendons of rubber that gripped the 2 modules and strained to keep them together. The rotation of the thrust module in relation to the hab had halted. They were one unit now, sharing a center of mass.
Jamal, I'm showing both habs with a relative velocity as close to 0 as we're gonna get. You did it. Now get back in here,
Mikhail said. You don't have to tell me twice. I'd already edged my way toward the airlock. A bubble of dark Nylar Epoxy B blocked my path, and I swiped at it without thinking. I'd forgotten the epoxy A which had drenched my suit. Instantly, foam started forming on my torso unit. It spread rapidly downward like mold. Oh, crap. I spun like a child's toy yo-yo, nauseous and disoriented. The hab blurred. I tumbled, whirling by a bright speck that must have been the thrust module's portal. Then I hit, biting my tongue, swallowing a little blood. I cursed. My spine stung with the shock, every vertebra complaining. I couldn't move my legs.
Jamal, you okay?
I'm good, I swore, trying to tug free. I pounded on the hull, breaking off small chunks of cured nylar. I just got myself stuck. There was a pause. I swear I heard laughing.
Don't panic,
he said.
You should have enough air. It's not long to ETA and you're not in any danger. We'll get you out. Just sit back and enjoy the view.
I struggled for a bit more before finally giving up, responding with an embarrassed sigh. Understood. I hung there, my spacesuit partially molded to the shell of Hab 1, and wondered what would happen next. The modules would continue their slow tumble toward the Lagrange settlements as a single unit now. Help was on its way. Everyone was safe, and Mikhail would probably recover from his wounds. I'd started this journey as a way of cleaning up the final elements of my life, of closing gaps I thought had been left open for far too long. I'd wanted to see the tin can cities they were building in the space between the planets because that was what the boy in me had wanted. But I was a man, an old man. Life had changed me in so many ways since then. I'd married, raised children, and conquered a small part of another world. All these things had enriched my life, transforming me from the boy whose only thoughts were of travel and escape. I would see Brihaspati, the small artificial world growing in leaps and bounds, but now I realized I needed more. I wasn't ready to die just yet. I wanted to continue on to the next dream and the one after that. I wanted to visit Terrant on Vesta. I wanted to travel to Earth, maybe not all the way to the crushing surface of the planet, but close enough to shake Mozart's hand and tell him how proud I was of him. Then I'd go home, to New Biloxi and the farm. I wanted to lay flowers at the foot of Miani's grave and apologize because she'd just have to wait a bit longer until I made it to heaven. Who knew where I would go after that? I slammed my arm down on the hab again, and it rang with a dull thud. The metal vibrated under me. Several sharp thumps followed, and for a moment I thought the hull had buckled. Then the noise repeated. My smile threatened to break through my helmet. It was Morse code. I must have landed near the airlock window because it was Mary. She knew I was out here, and somehow she knew how to contact me. I put one more item on my mental list of things I needed to do before I died. I wanted to meet the young lady who knew orbiter sign language, Morse code, and who knew what else. "Is that you, Jamal?" she tapped. "Are you okay?" "Oh, Mary," I laughed, and began to tap a reply. "You are some special kind of kid." We hope you enjoyed Moment of Inertia by D.A. D'Amico, read by Larissa Thompson. If you'd like to make a donation to the author and narrator of this story, check out the story page link in the description and click the PayPal donate button, or pledge your support to us directly on Patreon. Would you like to submit a story to the Centropic Oracle? A link to our submission guidelines can be found in the description.